We are resuming the series that we've been in. We took a break last week from the series for the Fifth Sunday Praise Service, but we are resuming the series today, where we are looking at stories from the life of David. And not just about David, but recognizing that David is described by God himself as a man after God's own heart. And so we can kind of get a picture of, we can learn something about God's heart when we look at the life of David. And so we have seen so far in this series, in the selection of David, the anointing of David, we saw a God who sees deeply into us, who cares about the person on the inside and not just external appearances. We saw as David took on Goliath, or probably more accurately, as God took on Goliath with David as his representative. We saw that he was the man in the middle, is literally the champion, the one who goes and he stands there to fight the battle that we cannot face. We see that ultimately come to fruition in Jesus as he takes on evil. We saw in David's connection to the prince, Jonathan, we saw in them that relational kind of solidarity, that we see a relational God, and we know that God cares about our connection to him and with one another as well. And the last time we were together in this series, we saw David in the cave. As he was kind of hiding out from Saul, and we saw him in the cave and wondering what was going to happen next, but discovering that God was with him, saw him in that difficult time. Today, we kind of continue in some of the cave season of David's life. He's still in some of the caves. He's going to be in a different cave today. He's still on the run, but he's in a new location, a place called Engedi. Can you imagine what David is feeling? You can imagine that he is getting tired of this. I mean, he was anointed years ago, and now he has been on the run. After coming to some prominence, he's been on the run for his life and wondering, how long is this going to last? When will we get to the part where everything comes together and God's promises are delivered? How long? Maybe it's telling that there are a number of psalms with those exact words that say, "How long, O Lord?" Have you ever felt that too? Been in some part of life where there's an ongoing season where you feel like you're in a holding pattern, wondering when the next thing is going to happen. And I think about the Disney movie Tangled. With the story of Rapunzel. And there early in the movie, she's locked away in the tower, and she is going through singing a song about her daily routine and all the things she does every day. And she says, "I am wondering, when will my life begin?" Maybe you can relate to that. When is it going to happen? We have hopes and we have dreams for the future. And maybe we even sense that God is calling us in a particular direction. But the longer the wait goes on, the more we get tempted to compromise. Our patience gets tested, and there are compromising shortcuts that show up that can be tempting. We are a people that are used to and taught to orienting our time around ourselves, orienting our expectations about what we want. We've been trained by so many advertisements that we choose a business because they will give us what we want when we want it. I remember Burger King's slogan used to be, "Your way, right away," at Burger King. So this story, though, the story we're looking at this morning with David, reminds us of a bigger perspective. It invites us to set our watches to the time zone of heaven, where we wait on God's timing. And so we pick up the story here in 1 Samuel chapter 24, and it says this: "When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, a report comes to Saul, and it says, 'Behold, David is in the wilderness of Engedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel And he went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. So this is where we are. We are in the land of Engedi. David has left the caves of Adullam and is now in a place called Engedi. Now, Engedi is something of an oasis in the middle of the wilderness. Today, the wilderness of Engedi is actually a nature preserve with beautiful hiking trails, and there are tons of caves that are throughout the region, tons of waterfalls that can be found. A lot of them are kind of hidden waterfalls. You got to kind of hike around into some places where you can't see them until you get right onto it. This is a picture that has some of the caves that you can see. In fact, those caves that you see along the side of the wall, those used to be at ground level, and so it's kind of eroded away in the years since. And so, who knows? Maybe one of these caves is one that David spent time in. Here's some more pictures of the area. You can see this kind of oasis. I show you because I want you to have in mind the place where David is in this story, where he's hiding out amid these rocks. And you see the cave there. You can, if you look carefully, you can kind of see back through there some of the waterfalls that are back in there. And it mentioned the wild goats. These are the wild goats. They're called ibex. And they're everywhere over there. But you can see them walking across the top of the hill there. Beautiful creatures. But this is where David is. It's in this place that David is going to encounter a huge opportunity. In the midst of wondering, how long will this take? He's going to encounter an opportunity to take a shortcut to his destiny and to seize the throne from Saul. And this is how it unfolds. As Saul goes after David with, remember, 3,000 men in pursuit of David, they go to that place. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave. And Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. And then David and his men just happened to be sitting in the innermost part of that very same cave. And the men of David said to David, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as that shall seem good to you." And then David arose and snuck over to Saul and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and he said to the men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, Saul, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." And so David persuaded his men, and with these words, he did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way, none the wiser at the moment that his life was at stake. You can imagine how this would be a powerful temptation for David. The opportunity is there. God has, in fact, ordained that David is supposed to be the next king of Israel. It's what God wants, after all, right? This is the moment that he could take his rightful, God-ordained place of power. But to sneak up and murder Saul would be to seize the opportunity to take what was his on his time and in his way in the wrong time, in the wrong way. I like to say that temptation is what happens at the intersection of desire and opportunity. Sometimes we have a desire that is within us. We want to do something, and then perhaps there's just no opportunity, and so it doesn't form into temptation yet. But when the opportunity comes along, that desire can meet up with the opportunity and present to us the temptation to move in a way that probably we shouldn't. And so whenever desire and opportunity come together in your life, we have to consider some things. We have to recognize what are the temptations that live at the corner of this desire and opportunity. We have to use some discernment. And so the first point this morning is that we must approach the opportunities in front of us with a godly discernment. Just because I want it and just because it's there isn't enough to say, yes, I should do that, right? And we ought to know that in all kinds of ways. Some of those are more obvious than others. But David, in this moment, he had to choose which voice was he going to listen to. Was he going to listen to his friends that said, hey, buddy, this is the opportunity you've been waiting for. This is the chance to seize the moment, to take the throne and get out of these caves. His friends encouraged him down that impulsive, undiscerned path. David's son, many years later, Solomon, would remind us in Proverbs 14, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. And in fact, this verse occurs again 2 chapters later, and so it's kind of an important thing to remember. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Our human impulses and our human desires cannot be trusted on their own. Because on their own, those human desires and impulses will prioritize things like personal comfort and convenience and pleasure and vengeance. It produces within us a self-focus that is ultimately destructive as it runs its course. And so those impulses can't just be left to their own. Those impulses and desires need to be brought under the wisdom of God to give them their direction. And James, the brother of Jesus, reminds us in James chapter 1, verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it'll be given to him. So if we want to bring God's wisdom into our discernment process, anytime there's an opportunity that meets up with one of our desires, we need to bring God's wisdom to bear on how we make that decision. David, as a man after God's own heart, is guided by that wisdom. He knows the Lord. And he is going to practice discernment in the midst of this opportunity. Even as he sneaks up to Saul and cuts off a corner of his robe, even in that moment, he starts to wonder if maybe he's gone too far. David wants to orient around what God wants rather than what he might want. And he realizes, as he points out, as he refers to Saul as God's anointed. Like he says, should I lay my hand on God's anointed? So he recognizes that God is the one who has appointed Saul to the position that he is in. And if somebody's going to remove him from that position, it's going to be God. And so David's like, I'm not seizing this from God. To seize this opportunity would be to try to seize it from God's hand. And so he practices discernment. Discernment is the ability to filter our opportunities. To kind of run those opportunities through God's character and through the commandments that God has given us, rather than through the filter of my desires and my conveniences. And so I want to give you, just real quick, we're not going to dwell long on this, but I want to think through this for just a moment with you. And if you have in mind, if there's something that you're facing currently that is an opportunity that is presented to a desire that you have, you can think through this even right now as we talk through it. I'm going to give you some questions that I've come up with that sort of help us to think through those things and bring them under the wisdom of God. We can ask ourselves some questions. First question has to do with the Scripture. Does walking through this door of opportunity require me to bypass or to bend or to break any of God's clear commands? That's the first thing we can ask ourselves. And by the way, if you follow along in the sermon notes in the church app, I put all of these questions in there as well. And so we ask ourselves the scripture question: does this call me to break any of what God has shown me He wants for our lives in the scriptures? The second question we can ask is about character. Am I acting out of a desire to glorify God, or am I simply grabbing a shortcut to relieve some discomfort or to satisfy some desire? The third we can ask is about timing. Am I running through this door of opportunity because I trust in God's timing and now is the right one, or am I trying to force my own destiny because I am tired of waiting? I realize these can be difficult questions to wrestle with sometimes. The fourth has to do with the Spirit. Is my spirit, sometimes we call it our conscience, but I'm intentionally choosing spirit because we want to listen to God's Spirit speaking to us, guiding us down certain paths. Am I listening to that? Do I experience within what I'm calling a holy hesitation? Is the Spirit in some way calling me to tap the brakes and consider, am I trying to ignore that impulse? Am I trying to quiet that down and explain it away? That's more than mere conscience. It is a conviction that the Spirit places in our hearts. And really that fourth one is probably the most important, but I put it at the end on purpose. Because we need to ask those earlier questions in order to understand whether we're listening to the Spirit's guidance or the deception of our own heart. We need to align ourselves with God's scriptures and knowing God's character and seeking to align our character with His and praying about God's timing. And then we want to listen. Is He telling me to pause? Is He saying no? Is He saying not right now? And this is not always black and white. This requires some time to reflect on and maybe discuss with your brothers and sisters and pray about. But what open door is in your life that's tempting you to maybe bypass God's standards? Tempting you to try to get what you want on your own timeline when maybe God has another timeline in mind? Whatever's there, I just encourage you this morning to step back and practice discernment. David decided, as he discerned the opportunity in front of him, he decided that he would not try to force God's hand, that he would not seize this from God's timeline, but he chose to be patient and, as I'm saying, set his watch to heaven's time zone. And so, verse 8, afterward, this is after Saul has left the cave, David arose and he went out of the cave and he called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you." I try to imagine Saul's expression on his face, exiting the cave and hearing the voice of David that he recognizes come from behind him. You picture it? The look of surprise, of perhaps fear, of that being caught off guard, of recognizing. Have you ever been in that situation where you realize something could have just happened? Like you've gotten to the other side of it and you realize maybe you lost control of your car for a second and then it regained, and then you realize that could have been really bad. Like, you ever have that feeling? Picture that with Saul right here, recognizing in that instant his life had been in danger. David then goes on, we won't read through it, but he goes on to reveal to Saul the patch of fabric that he cut from Saul's cloak. Recognizing how close he was able to get to Saul with a weapon. Saul was completely at David's mercy in that moment, but it was a mercy that he provided. He reveals what he could have done, but he chose instead to wait on the Lord and to trust in God's timing. And something happens when we do that. Waiting on God's timing teaches us to trust in His wisdom and in His sovereignty, rather than our own way of thinking and our own little rule over our own little realms that we have influence over. We trust in His wisdom, which is much greater, of course, in His sovereignty, which is all-encompassing. I suspect that this whole scene, the text doesn't say this explicitly, but I suspect that God orchestrated this moment as a test for David. God does this time and time again in the scriptures where He tests the people that He's training, which is not to say He's tempting them. It is saying He is organizing something together as a test that they can discover something new about themselves, that they can experience this, it is a learning opportunity where they're forced to make a choice. And I suspect that's what God is doing with David here, causing him to come to this point where he has to wrestle with this choice of what to make. And when he does so, he comes out the other side, I think, stronger, more fortified in his faith. Later in his life, David would reflect on these events. You can read Psalm 57 through that lens. We'll look at a couple of parts of it. But Psalm 57, verse 6, he says, this is David, "They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves." And you see how Saul was in pursuit of David, and he had brought a whole army with him to try to hunt down David. He was going after him, and yet Saul was the one that was in danger in this whole scenario. He had set a trap for him, but he fell into the trap himself. He went into that cave, and that cave was more or less a trap that could have been sprung on him, though David chose otherwise. At the beginning of that very same psalm, David acknowledges this. He says, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to the Most High, to God who fulfills His purpose for me." You see this? God is the place of refuge for David. It's not even the cave. It's not even the companions that David has surrounded himself with that work together with him. They aren't his refuge. God is his ultimate refuge. He says this kind of thing over and over. And it's His purpose, God's purpose, that he is after. He cries out to the God Most High, God who fulfills His purpose for me. Not my purpose, David says, your purpose. And as a result, even though he was literally being hunted, in the midst of that, David says, "My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast, and I will sing and make melody." Can you imagine being hunted by the most powerful person in the region, with an army of thousands of warriors coming after you, and being able to say about your condition that you are steadfast? As you feel like you are on stable ground, you are in a place that is fixed and established and stable, you have an anchor. And you can even sing. You know, when we want to grow something, we plant the seeds. You put the seeds down into the dirt where it's dark and wet and dirty, and it has to stay there. There's nothing that you can do other than providing some water. There's nothing that you can do to make those roots grow. In fact, if you tried to dig it up every few days and try to find the roots that were coming and give them a little tug, try to make them grow a little longer, that would be counterproductive. It just wouldn't work. You'd end up destroying the plant. You have to leave it alone in the nourishing soil and trust God's designed process. And sometimes you and I are those seeds too. We're in the soil, the dark place that we don't want to be. But God is growing something there. He is causing something to happen, and the roots can go down deeper, and we entrust the process to God. David declares to Saul, "May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." You see what he does? He says, look, Saul, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not taking action against you. I'm leaving it all to God. It is God's time. It is God's power. He is the one that you have to deal with. So quit coming after me. He's entrusting the way forward to God, which is in stark contrast, by the way, to the way that Saul has ruled. If you remember the story, Saul, the last straw that got the kingdom taken away from Saul was because he refused to wait on Samuel to come along and offer a sacrifice. And he took matters into his own hands. He would not wait. But waiting on God's timing teaches us to trust in his wisdom and to know his sovereignty. So this morning, how is your patience? Is there anywhere in your life that you're trying to push a resolution before it's time? And I ask you, what would it take to step back, to take your hands off the controls for a minute, and to trust God in his sovereign wisdom to deliver on his promises in his time? You know, maybe now is the time. Maybe you are at the threshold of the time that God is going to do something, but we ought to at least consider. We ought to ask God and turn things over to him and entrust it to his perfect timing. Because when we actually believe that God's wisdom is perfect, when we understand that his sovereignty is absolute, when we are actually able to let go of the control and leave it to him, I recognize I don't have to be the master of my own destiny. I don't have to know everything about what's going to happen in the future. I don't have to know every step that I'm going to take. I just need to take the next faithful step. I just keep stepping faithfully and trust him. And it is that kind of deep anchoring that allows us to be the kind of people that show mercy, that walk with grace, and have an integrity, even in the midst of opposition, which is what we see David doing. When David does what he does, it has an immediate impact on Saul. And Saul is shaken when he recognizes what just happened and what just didn't happen, right? He is shaken. And this is what happens. In verse 16, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" Suddenly, he's my son David, right? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. You have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king." Get that. "And that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." David swore this to Saul. And then David went home. Then Saul went home, but David went up and his men went to the stronghold, which we talked about last time. when Saul realizes that David had his life in his hands and yet chose to show him mercy, we see an instant change in Saul. This kind of erratic, paranoid king is moved to tears. He is moved to tears. David had trusted God. And that faith meant that he didn't have to take Saul's life in order to protect his own. He trusted God to take care of him. And so because of that, he was freed up to be able to show mercy. He didn't feel like he was forced into doing something. He was free to show mercy. He was free to then, as a result, display God's gracious character. That's really where we see the heart of God in all of this morning, I think. The faith that is born out of learning to wait on God and trust in His wisdom, that faith allows us to be people that extend radical mercy and reveal God's grace. The thing that people need to see around us. As David showed this mercy, as he lived out this grace in this moment, it transformed the encounter entirely. Again, remember, Saul had brought 3,000 troops. He was going to come and eliminate David. That's what he was after. But what happens is Saul, in this moment, ends up confessing that he believes David will be the next king. Isn't that interesting? He goes from seeking to eliminate the threat to validating his claim on the throne. And while this isn't the end of the story, there is more to come in their back and forth. It is in this moment kind of a moral victory. There is a victory that emerges from God's grace that is on display in this story. And that's really where we see the heart of God, I think. Remember that Jesus taught, and this is from Luke 6:35, he says, "Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. You'll be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful." And you see what Jesus is teaching is exactly what we saw reflected in David. When he says to love your enemies and to be kind and do things that are good for those who wouldn't do the same for you. To show mercy. And why? He says, then you will be sons of the Most High. Culturally speaking, to say that somebody is a son of someone else is a way of saying that they are a reflection of their character. You can see them. You can see the Father in the Son. That's the way of thinking. And so he says, when you do these things, you are an accurate reflection of the character of God. Because we see the way that He is merciful and He provides for people even when they do the wrong thing. So when we extend mercy to those who have targeted us, we're standing in contrast to the ways of the world, because the world doesn't do that. The world seeks to get even, or really to one up usually. And when we do this, when we show mercy, when we walk in this kind of grace because we're reliant on God, we know His wisdom and we trust in His timing, we can resonate with God's heart as well. We can hum the same note, so to speak. In the early church, there's multiple stories that emerge from the first couple of centuries of the church where Roman soldiers and jailers were converted by the Christians that they were persecuting. Around 300 AD, there's a story of a couple of Christians who were sentenced to be executed. And they were carried out into the woods and forced to dig their own graves. And as they dug, they did so joyfully, singing. And they even knelt to pray with their executioner, a guy named Dorotheus. And he was so moved by that down the road he could not get that out of his head. and he became a Christian. And he became somebody that ended up being persecuted as well. But this led to him. These Christians showed love and mercy to the one who was going to kill them. And God reached that heart through that interaction. It's an amazing thing. It happened time and time again. There's tons of stories like that from the first few centuries of the church. David had showed kindness and mercy to Saul. Out of his devotion to God, because he trusted God's power, he trusted God's timing over his own, and that changed everything. So this morning, do you have an adversary in your life? Whether a real person or a situation, do you have a Saul in your life? Someone or something or some scenario that has hurt you, that's made you feel targeted, that has made you feel miserable at times. Just consider for a moment, what would it look like to bring God's heart into that situation? What would it look like to live as a person full of mercy and grace in the midst of difficult things? Can you imagine how God's power would work to transform that situation or those hearts that are connected to it? We ought to set our time to heaven's time zone and quit trying to force things on our own time and in our own way, relying on what little strength we have in this world, but entrust it to our God. And so may we let go of our need to have things our way right away. May we choose instead to trust God's way and God's time. And may He teach us to practice godly discernment in the face of the opportunities that are in front of us. And may we show His gracious heart in all that we do. This morning, we are here for you. And as Don mentioned, we are going to have the elders and myself will be in the back of the room during this next song, which we call an invitation song. And if you have any needs at all, we would invite you to reach out. If you want to be baptized today, become a follower of Jesus, we would love to do that. If you want to talk to somebody and just have an ear to listen, we'll do that for you. If you want somebody to pray with you, we'd be happy to do that as well. Anything that you need, we are here for you this morning. And so I'm going to read one final verse, and then we'll sing the invitation song, and we'll be in the back of the room for you. So here's the final verse. Isaiah 30, verse 18. Therefore, the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore He exalts Himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for Him. If we can be there for you this morning, would you please reach out as we stand and sing?